Thanks very much for having me. It sounds like you can hear me pretty well, but please let me know if not. My name is Gabriel Ehrlich, and I direct the research seminar in quantitative economics, which is the economic forecasting unit at the University of Michigan. Unfortunately, my slides are going to be a lot less exciting than what you just saw, so hopefully you can bear with me. But I will be focusing primarily on the economy today and not really getting into finance too much, but I'm really excited to present our long-term demographic and economic outlook for the state of Michigan today. And we produced this forecast recently with sponsorship from the Michigan Department of Transportation. And I have to start off by confessing that I'm actually cheating a little bit because my forecast only goes through 2050, not through 2052. So, I'm sorry if you really came for 2052, if I brought you here under false pretenses, but I'm hoping if you kind of squint at the end of my graphs, you can see what 2052 will look like. Today, I'm going to focus on our forecast for the state of Michigan, and I'll show you some results for some of the different regions and counties in the state. We've got a detailed report on our website that you can download that goes into detail on our U.S. forecast assumptions. So if you want to know what we're assuming about the broader economy that fed into our outlook for the state of Michigan, you can find it online. But that being said, because of the importance of the auto industry here in Michigan, I do want to take a little bit of time to describe our outlook for the automotive industry, and in particular, the transition to electric vehicles, because it's a question we get a lot in the state. The first thing to say is that we anticipate a relatively slow adoption of EVs in the United States, at least compared to some other forecasters. So typically, when we present our outlook for the transition to EVs, the reaction we get is that's slower than I've heard from some other sources. We're projecting that about 9% of new light vehicle sales will be fully electric in 2025. And so just to clarify, when I say EVs, I mean fully electric, and I'm going to compare that to what you might hear called ICE vehicles or internal combustion vehicles, and I include hybrid vehicles in that category. In our forecast, EV sales increase to about 54% by 2040, so getting up above half by 2040, and then finally reach 100% of new light vehicle sales in 2050. But because of the long operational life of new motor vehicles, we expect that traditional and ICE vehicles, or hybrid ICE vehicles, will continue to account for the majority of the U.S. vehicle fleet on the road right up until 2050, and that EVs will take over the majority after that. Electric vehicles have significantly fewer parts than ICE vehicles, and by some estimates, they require about 30% less labor to assemble. So in the long run, we expect the shift to EVs to reduce employment in motor vehicle manufacturing. Okay, we get, it's a big topic of conversation in Michigan. We get this question. That's our estimate is that in the very long run, it is true that the shift to EVs will reduce employment in auto manufacturing. But the relatively slow adoption of EVs, in our forecast at least, means that their impact on motor vehicle manufacturing employment is going to be muted in the near term and medium term, honestly. And in fact, we actually expect the shift to EVs to help sustain manufacturing employment at first, as companies produce both electric vehicles and ICE vehicles. So there's going to be a transition period where the companies are producing both types of vehicles. That should actually boost employment in the short run. And so with that in mind, we expect U.S. employment in motor vehicles and parts manufacturing to hold just around 950,000 jobs from 2023 through 2032. Motor vehicle manufacturing employment then starts to decline after that as traditional ICE vehicle manufacturing phases out. And employment falls to just a bit over 800,000 jobs by 2050. And I do want to say, obviously, anytime you project out 30 years, you're asking for trouble. So, just one risk is if the introduction of electric vehicles occurs more quickly than we anticipate, then those job losses would likely occur sooner and be more severe than we've projected. So turning now to Michigan, this slide shows you Michigan's share of total U.S. real GDP in our forecast. Michigan's share of national output fell sharply in the first decade of this century, as hopefully you can see on the graph. And then it really bounced up and down in the second decade of the century, so over the past 10 years, essentially. Michigan's share of national GDP fell in 2020, but we do expect it to recover back to about its pre-pandemic level this year in 2022, and then stay roughly there through 2032. After that, we project Michigan's share of GDP to decline slowly as employment in auto manufacturing starts to fall off. And Michigan's share of US GDP falls to about 2.5% by 2050. Something I want to point out, if you look at this slide, you might think that we're forecasting decline for Michigan, and that's not right. It's a relative metric. We are forecasting Michigan's GDP to keep growing through 2050. It's just that US GDP grows more quickly than in Michigan. So Michigan declines relative to the national economy. And a major reason that Michigan lags behind is demographic change. And so I'm going to actually spend a decent amount of time talking about that. And the reason is that the reality is that population growth is going to represent a significant speed limit for Michigan's long-run employment and economic growth over the next few decades. The more people we have, the more job growth we'll be able to sustain as well. Michigan's population reached a record high of nearly 10,080,000 people in 2019, just before the pandemic. The population in the state then declined in 2020 and 2021 because of the pandemic, and we also expect it to decline by an additional 5,000 people in 2022. But we do forecast the state population to start growing again next year, reaching a peak of 10,540,000 in 2046. So that's the peak on this graph. And then you can see just at the end of the graph here, let's see if I can get the clicker to work, you can see we're forecasting a gentle, a small decline or a modest decline in the second half of the 2040s, so through 2050. Okay, this slide is complicated, I apologize, but it really shows you a lot of what's going to be going on in Michigan's future over the next few decades. So I hope you'll bear with me through this slide. What we've done is to break out the components of population growth into a few different categories. The first one is natural growth, which is births minus deaths, and that's in the blue line on the slide. Then we have international migration to Michigan in the gray line, and then we've split out what's called domestic migration, so moves to or from Michigan within the United States. We've split that out into two different parts: domestic migration of the population below age 65 and migration of the senior population, age 65 and older. So there are 4 lines on the chart, and I'll just go through them in turn. The gray line shows net international migration to Michigan, and historically this has been a very important source of population growth for the state, but it dipped sharply during the pandemic. We're projecting it to pick back up to about 22,000 net migrants per year to Michigan going forward, which is more in line with the historical pattern. The yellow line shows net migration of the population age 65 or older. And Michigan has been losing between 5,000 and 7,000 seniors every year who basically retire to other states. And we're expecting that those population losses of senior citizens to stay fairly steady around that level going forward. The green line shows you domestic migration of the population age 64 and younger. And it's more responsive than senior migration is to conditions in the local labor market, which is why we've split it out. Just the reality is that other things being equal, workers will tend to migrate to areas with high labor demand and where wages are higher. And you can see, at my left part of the chart, that Michigan consistently lost people of working age over the past decade amid a pretty weak labor market relatively. Although obviously things improved over the course of the past decade. We expect this green line, the domestic migration of people 64 and younger, to oscillate a little more tightly around 0 over the next 3 decades, with Michigan's relatively weak labor market from the past 20 years in the rearview mirror. Natural population growth, which again is births minus deaths, is in the blue line, and is probably the most important line on this chart, and potentially the most important line that I'm going to show you all day. During the pandemic, Michigan experienced reduced births and increased deaths, so both elements of natural growth were moving in the wrong direction. And that meant that natural population growth in Michigan fell off a cliff. Fortunately, we expect Michigan to return to positive natural population growth again by 2024. The demographic fundamentals slowly move against us after that, though. The number of births in Michigan declines each year, while the number of deaths increases. And by 2040, deaths are expected to outnumber births in Michigan every year, so that natural population growth is negative. Right? So you can see that blue line dipping below 0. Only one of the lines on this figure remains positive throughout the graph, and that's international migration. By 2050, we expect Michigan to see more deaths than births each year and to be losing both senior citizens and younger residents to other states. So international migration will be the only source of growth that Michigan has left by that point. And starting in the late 2040s, we project that international migration won't be enough to outweigh the drag from the other categories of population growth. And at that point, we expect the state's population to begin declining. This chart shows you our forecast of Michigan's population by age group. And a few important trends jump out of this graph. First, the blue line shows the population of young people aged 24 and below, and it shows that that younger population slowly declines over time in Michigan with the decline in births. The yellow line shows you that the number of senior citizens rises sharply over the next 15 years through about 2037. And you can see that's a continuation of a trend that's been in place for quite some time now. You can see, the yellow line has been rising for quite some time. After 2037, though, that yellow line flattens out due to seniors leaving the state or passing away. Third, Michigan's working age population, aged 25 to 64, is shown in the green and gray lines. And the state's population in those key working age years is expected to decline by about 145,000 from 2020 to 2029. And that means that workers are going to have a very hard time. That means that employers are going to have a very hard time finding workers over the next decade. Right? So these demographic trends really do have an important influence on the economic trends that we see for the state. So turning to employment, this uses the Bureau of Economic Analysis measure of employment for the state of Michigan. And by that measure, Michigan's employment count reached record high levels in 2018 and 2019, before the pandemic. Obviously, we lost a large number of jobs in 2020, but the recovery is well underway at this point. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, we've recovered more than 90% of the jobs we lost at the start of the pandemic at this point here in Michigan. And we forecast that Michigan's job recovery over the next 3 years should put employment about 2% above its 2019 level by 2024. But we expect employment growth to slow down dramatically after that, including an 8-year stretch in the 2030s when employment really isn't expected to grow at all here in the state of Michigan. And as I mentioned to you before, the demographic slowdown that I showed you puts a really sharp speed limit on how fast Michigan can grow economically. This slide shows you employment in Michigan as a share of national employment. And Michigan's share has been declining pretty steadily over the first 20 years of the millennium, although not as quickly over the past 10 years as it did over the first 10 years of the millennium. And you can see that Michigan's share of national employment is forecast to remain roughly flat over the next decade as job growth in the state keeps pace with the nation overall. But after that, we again lag behind the nation in employment growth, and our share of national employment resumes its decline through 2050. So turning to motor vehicle manufacturing or auto manufacturing, this slide shows you the state's share of national auto manufacturing employment. And actually, it might surprise you, we expect Michigan's share of national employment in auto manufacturing to rise over the next decade, because we expect auto manufacturers, again, as I mentioned, to be producing both EVs and traditional ICE vehicles at scale. And that should boost local labor demand in the near term. But Michigan's share of auto manufacturing employment then starts to slide in the late 2030s as traditional ICE manufacturing wanes. And we project Michigan to return back to its average employment share from the past decade by 2050. So you can see, a hump shape where it's rising at first and then falling in the second part of the forecast. If you recall, though, we're forecasting national employment in auto manufacturing to fall by nearly 20% from 2019 to 2050. So even though Michigan's share of national employment holds up in our forecast, in terms of the actual job count, we're projecting a decline. This table summarizes employment growth by industry in our forecast, and I'm going to try not to spend too much time reading numbers to you, but at the bottom, what you can see is that we forecast overall employment growth in Michigan to be about 0.19% per year from 2019 to 2050. So we wanted to start just before the pandemic, so the pandemic didn't distort the measurements. The fastest growing major industry in our forecast is private education and health services, which is in large part driven by the aging population, boosting demand for health care. We also expect construction to grow quickly with large capital investments related to EVs. And we see wholesale trade and transportation and warehousing to grow at a strong pace with the ongoing rise of e-commerce as well. Looking at the bottom of the table, the industry with the fastest rate of job loss is retail trade, which is losing jobs to online retail, and we believe that that trend has further to run in the forecast. And then as I noted, motor vehicle and parts manufacturing also loses jobs due to the EV transition, despite Michigan maintaining its share of national employment in the industry. This slide shows personal income per capita in Michigan and in the United States, adjusted for inflation and differences in the local cost of living. So it's about as apples to apples a comparison as we could come up with over time and over space. In 2001, Michigan's adjusted personal income per capita was slightly below the US average. Not a lot, but just slightly below. But what you can see hopefully on the graph is that the gap widened over the past 20 years, and by 2019, Michigan was trailing the US average by almost 10%. Over the forecast, we do expect real personal income in Michigan per capita to grow just a tad faster in the state than the nation overall. So that by 2050, we will have gradually narrowed that gap to about 5.3%. So we are closing the gap slightly with the United States in terms of living standards in our forecast. So with that, I wanted to switch gears and look at the outlook for Michigan's different regions. And this slide shows you our forecast of cumulative county-level population change from 2020 to 2050 for each of the counties in Michigan. And we've divided our forecast into 4 categories, 2 that represent population growth in the green colors, and 2 that represent population declines in the orange and red colors. We expect Michigan's total population to grow by about 4.5% cumulatively from 2020 to 2050. But as you can see, that growth is not spread evenly throughout the state of Michigan. We actually expect more counties to lose population than to grow by a tally of 45 to 38. Counties losing population tend to be located along or near Lake Huron, as well as in the Upper Peninsula, where only 2 counties, Houghton and Marquette, are expected to see population growth. The counties with the greatest population declines also tend to have high shares of senior citizens today. The fastest growing counties in Michigan are in suburban Detroit, and then in a band stretching across the middle of the state through Kent and Ottawa County to Lake Michigan, as well as in the tourist-oriented and retiree-friendly northwestern region of the Lower Peninsula. And the 5 counties with the greatest expected population gains are Livingston, Clinton, Benzie, Ottawa, and Washtenaw. This is a very, continuing on this theme, this slide shows our employment forecast by county. And so it's probably not surprising to you that this map looks similar to the map of population change that I just showed. The scale is a little different in this map, but in general, counties that are gaining population are also more likely to be gaining jobs in our forecast. And once again, we actually expect more counties to lose employment than to gain employment between 2019 and 2050 in Michigan. Even so, there are differences. There's not a perfect correlation with our population forecast. The most favorable outlooks are generally for counties with large shares of employment in industries with strong growth prospects, as well as with supporting growth in their working age populations. So it's really a 1-2 combination. The top 5 counties in terms of job growth in our forecast are Livingston, Ionia, Washtenaw, Emmett, and Oakland. Whereas the counties with the greatest declines tend to be in rural areas and to have a higher current share of people age 65 and older. Shifting demographics and the overall aging of the population in Michigan have been a consistent theme in our outlook for the state. I've spent a lot of time talking about them. So what I wanted to do is wrap up with a couple of maps showing you how the share of the senior population will change between now and 2050, really between 2020 and 2050. The map on the left shows the share of each county's population age 65 or older in 2020, and the map on the right shows our forecast for 2050. Statewide, 17.7% of the population in 2020 was 65 years old or older. And we expect that number to rise almost 5 percentage points, which in these terms is a lot, to 22.4% by 2050. And hopefully what you can see on the map is that the senior population share, is that there was a lot of variation in different counties' senior population shares in 2020. The share was less than 20% in 37 counties, and it was more than 30% in 10 counties. But we project that by 2050, there will be only 3 counties with a senior population share less than 20%. On the opposite end, we expect only 1 county to have a senior population share over 30%. Most of the counties in Michigan will have a senior population share between 20 and 25% by 2050. And that's because the counties that are younger today will tend to get older due to the decline in natural population growth, whereas the counties that are older today will actually tend to get younger as their older residents pass away. So it's, I don't know how you want to interpret that news. It's a mixed bag. But anyways, just to wrap up, and I know I'm at time, we expect demographic trends to limit Michigan's population and employment growth over the next 30 years. And international immigration to Michigan will be very important for sustaining growth in this environment. We expect Michigan's employment in motor vehicle manufacturing to decline, but how soon and how much will be determined by how quickly the market shifts to electric vehicles. Labor shortages will continue to pose a challenge in Michigan, especially over the next decade, due to declines in the prime working age population. And meanwhile, Michigan's senior population will continue to increase rapidly through 2037. Finally, I just wanted to take 10 seconds to tell you about my group's Economic Outlook Conference, which is next month, November 17th and 18th in Ann Arbor. If you're interested in this type of thing, you want to see more graphs, I've got you covered. If you Google RSQE, we should be the first people who pop up. So thank you very much.